Hello, grade 11 econ students. I wanted to record this video to complete your understanding of the business cycle because you will be studying it on your own and taking your notes. So I thought this would supplement that and you can finish off with your studies of the business cycle. And when you come on Monday, we can have like a very short little question and answer or a quiz or something to see your understanding of the business cycle. So let's continue with just pick up from where we left off in class of the business cycle, which is changes in a nation's GDP over time, which can be illustrated in a simple economic model called as the business cycle. Just to bring up this slide, the business cycle is a model which shows short term fluctuations in the real GDP growth. So it is showing the change in real GDP, which you take on the y axis, you label it as real GDP, and on the x axis, you label it as time. So you're showing the change in real GDP over time and the short term fluctuations of the real GDP growth. And the long term trend line is the potential GDP. So you're showing things like expansions, which is an increase in real GDP, and a contraction, which is a decrease in real GDP. Coming back to this slide, so there are four stages in a nation's business cycle. I have slightly changed these slides to reflect exactly what's there in the textbook so that there's no confusion when you're studying with the textbook, hopefully. Okay, so the four stages are: one is expansion, which is recovery, which represents a growing economy. There's rising employment of resources, there's a rising price level because that's when the economy is growing. The unemployment rate is actually lesser than the natural rate of unemployment. There's an increase in real GDP. There's an increase in national income. And real GDP is greater than potential GDP. So that's the expansion phase. If we look at this diagram, which is again from your textbook, this is the expansion phase from A to D. At point A, you can actually see that there is the real GDP is equal to the potential GDP. At point B, also, you can see the same thing, and at point C, also, you can see the same thing. But at point D, you see that real GDP is greater than potential GDP. So it's much above this dotted line. Okay, this is a positive output gap, and the unemployment rate is lesser than the natural rate of unemployment, right? So this is that inflationary gap which you show through your EDAS or your monetarist diagram. As we can see here, this is an inflationary gap. So it corresponds with this. You can also use the Keynesian diagram to show that inflationary gap and correspond it with the business cycle and showing that expansion. So this is the first stage of the business cycle. The second stage of the business cycle is when the economy reaches its peak, which is the maximum point of your expansion wave. So to see a peak, we can pull up my diagram and you can see the peak right up there. Okay, so that's given over here. The peak is the place where you can see maximum real GDP. The unemployment of resources has fallen substantially, which means that mostly all the resources are now fully employed. In fact, the maximum employment of resources has been reached and the price level is rising rapidly. If you connect this with the Keynesian diagram, can you show it on the Keynesian diagram? Can you show it marking your real GDP at Y max? Make sure you are able to show that on that diagram so that you can use this very effectively for your essays when you talk about the relationship or show how the business cycle and the ADAS diagrams, show the same concepts. Okay. The next stage of a business cycle is a contraction or the recession stage, which is a shrinking economy. Now, a recession is 2 quarters or more of the fall in real GDP. There's a growing unemployment of resources, price level increases actually slow down and may even begin to fall in some sectors. If you look at the business cycle, here is the contraction phase. Okay. And at the contraction phase, you can see the decrease in real GDP. You can see an increase in unemployment. You can see a decrease in the price level, right? Or a slowdown in the increase in the price level. Like the price level may be increasing, but really slowly. Through the business cycle, you cannot see the price level because the business cycle only is looking at real GDP over time. So if you look at the difference between a business cycle and an ADAS diagram, whether it's the monetarist or whether it's the Keynesian model, is actually going to show you the price level along with the real GDP. But this one is only concentrating on the real GDP and the change over time because it shows the short term fluctuations in real GDP. That's what the business cycle is about. The fourth stage is the trough, which is the minimum point of your wave. So the trough, I'll show it over here. You can see it's marked over here. All right. So when that contraction keeps happening, there comes a point when you reach that very minimum point of the wave, the minimum downward point of the wave. This is where you have minimum real GDP, you have widespread unemployment, and it marks the beginning of a new cycle because recovery will follow. Now, when we talk about the long term growth trend, which is the dotted line, which represents the potential output, notice that despite the short term fluctuations, the economy tends to grow over time, right? Because you can see that steep curve or you can see that upward sloping long term growth trend, which means that the economy tends to grow over time. It's very rare to see an economy which is actually stagnating over time in the long term. There will be downward, maybe for an economy, the real GDP is going down a lot, more like steeper, or I would say severe, intense, right? Intense, big waves downwards, and maybe very small waves upwards, right? But in general, over time, there will be a long term growth trend which is sloping upwards. Okay. And let's come to this diagram here, which is again just giving you clarity on what's happening between points A to B and points B to C. Remember that the potential GDP shown by this dotted line on the trend line shows NRU equal to 5%. Okay. And at this part, you have a negative output gap. This part, you have a positive output gap, right? Let's move on. Notice from the business cycle model that economic growth, that is an increase in GDP, occurs over time, but not always at a steady rate. It will be very different for every economy because every economy experiences these fluctuations, but to different degrees. We will come back to this, but remember there's a difference in the decrease in GDP versus the decrease in the GDP growth rate. The growth rate is whenever you see the word rate, honestly, it's just a percentage. So the growth rate is the percentage change in GDP between two periods of time. When an economy is approaching a peak in its business cycle, then the rate of growth will begin to fall. When a recession begins, the actual output of an economy decreases. This means the growth rate has become negative. So there's a difference between the growth rate and actual decrease in GDP. Okay, in our study of macro, we will focus on how the tools of macroeconomics can help policymakers achieve several objectives. Every economy has these four objectives, which is why policies have these four objectives, which is to get full employment so that most of the nation's workers are able to find a job and then the nation's resources are being put towards the production of goods and services. Price levels should be relatively stable. That's what economies strive for, keeping inflation low and households' real incomes keeping them pretty high. Because if price levels are not stable, it will lead to uncertainty. And uncertainty is something that all economic agents, that is, all the stakeholders in any economy, try to avoid. They don't like uncertainty. We don't like uncertainty because, as let's say, workers, right, don't like uncertainty because they don't know how much their income will be worth. Consumers don't like uncertainty because they don't know what prices they will be paying. Investors don't like uncertainty because they don't know how much they should invest or how much their investment will be worth. So firms don't like it. Governments obviously don't like uncertainty. So all economic agents and foreign right, buyers, sellers, exporters, importers, they don't like uncertainty. So price level stability is obviously one of the major aims or objectives of macro policy, just like full employment. The third one is economic growth. Every economy wants an increase in output and income over time because it's needed to sustain a growing population and ensure that the average person enjoys a higher standard of living over time. And then another objective that economies, governments strive for in their policy is to improve equality in the distribution of income. Now, when we talk about the steepness, or rather not steepness, the intensity of the curves, the waves of the business cycle, if the economy is actually achieving its economic macroeconomic objectives of full employment, of price level stability, of economic growth, especially price level stability and full employment, then the wave will be closer to potential output, right? So the blue line is a stable, steadily growing economy. Recessions are less severe, peaks are, and troughs are less extreme. Unemployment rises by less during recessions, and inflation is lower during expansions. So that is the blue line is a relatively stable economy, which is less volatile, less uncertain, and that's what every government aims towards. They don't like this kind of a wave pattern, right? And lastly, sorry. The last one is the steepness of the potential output line. Now, increasing the steepness of the line shows that you want more rapid economic growth over long periods of time. Again, this is something that we discussed as a macroeconomic objective of having economic growth. So, the idea is to have more rapid economic growth over long periods of time and hence increase the steepness of this potential output line. Okay, so that wraps up our business cycle. Remember to finish up.